Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at making arguments and developing an argument based on using a short story. Now, you may not necessarily come across a lot of short stories when you are when you're doing English study and English work. However, that's not to say that these short stories aren't good as, first of all, as practice, and second of all, a good thing to use as your supporting material. Now, we're going to be looking at it in a couple of senses. Obviously, we're going to be looking at it in terms of if you are studying it, how you would go about interpreting it and using the detail from it, and then being able to make an argument from that detail. But we're also going to be looking at it in terms of it being a supporting article and how you would use it as a supporting article. Okay, so the focus should be on finding some small and important points rather than a whole bag of techniques and ideas. You need to be very selective of what pot of gold you choose. So that's the reason for that image there, is that you want to be choosing the right pot of gold at the end of your rainbow. You don't want to be finding a whole heap of things and then trying to cram them into one section of your response, particularly if you're using it as a supporting article. Your supporting article is just there to support your main text. So if you're trying to overburden it with ideas that you've taken from your short story, then you need to think about trying to condense that a little bit. And as I said, if you feel like you've wasted effort in interpreting a text, a cohesive response is always a lot better. So try and figure about just developing your points rather than necessarily coming up with a whole heap of techniques and just slotting them in, as in I picked about 20 or 30 different points from the text and I'm going to try and fit them all into one essay. That's never a good idea. No more than, depending on what sort of point you're trying to make, and you're only choosing evidence to support your point. Now, obviously, you won't be using quotes and you won't be using evidence because that will prove your argument. However, you don't want to be doing it too much, and you certainly don't want to be listing bits of evidence, because by listing bits of evidence, you're not proving anything, you're just listing things. If you're able to then discuss and develop your evidence and explain why it's relevant, why you've chosen it, why almost the bloody knife is necessary for your answer, then that's when that murder weapon, the bloody knife, has some significance. So if you look at it from a detective mystery point of view, and certainly when people try to use evidence in something like a court case, they do it, but they also explain it. So this is what you need to do. Okay, and this is where the cohesive argument comes in, and it's where it's always better than just listing things. All right, we'll move on. So the greatness of short stories, as I said before, is that they're easy to write about, because once you get over understanding them, they actually give you a lot. Many will have a great variety of techniques, will have a prominent theme, and have its own unique style. So there you have a lot of angles you can actually talk about, and it will cover a lot of different types of questions. Now, the great thing about particularly classic short stories, and written by particularly the romantic and certainly the classic authors, particularly around sort of looking at the period about 1850s to about the 1940s, 1950s, you've got a wide variety of short story writers who write with a number of different ideas and themes and these sorts of things, but do so in such a prominent and overt kind of way. They stand out. And so when it comes to writing about them, they make it relatively simple. Obviously, the hard part, though, is understanding them, because a lot of them really write in a metaphorical and allegorical kind of style. A kind of style that immediately is almost baffling on first reading. But the more you practice doing it, and certainly to go around and read a few short stories, first of all, it's quicker than reading novels. Second of all, it's less difficult than poetry, and certainly is less personally expressive than poetry. You will get a story out of these. And particularly some of them are stories which might be familiar to you. But it's always interesting to hear the origins of these kinds of stories. And certainly a lot of very famous films and famous books were based on short stories that started beforehand. So it's always good to sort of read around and have a look at a different sort of variety of short stories and have a look at the ideas and what sorts of thoughts and ideas they provoke. And also, you can interpret them in a greater number of ways. So in terms of a novel, which you may read for enjoyment, and certainly I hope you do read for enjoyment, but the thing is, by interpreting a novel, you've only got a certain limited amount of aspects you can actually talk about it with. Whereas with a short story, even though it's shorter, you get more. So you get more from less, basically. So less reading, more techniques and ideas which you can discuss, and certainly more prominent ideas and themes which will seem more meaningful and certainly will make your response stand out, especially if you're referring to really strong, short, classic stories. All right, let's have a look at language techniques and why these are important for what you will be looking at in terms of writing a response. Now, an author's style and quality generally varies, particularly in the classic short stories. Not all of them are going to be brilliant, but the thing is, they have a number of things in common which make them very, very effective as a supporting text. First of all, they condense language. And by condensing language, it's almost written with a sense of poetry about it. So particularly if you're sort of stuck with that jump from reading novels and watching films to poetry, short stories is often actually a very good sort of go-between, and that it's not necessarily poetry, but it's not necessarily a prose fiction narrative either. So they condense language in such a way, because often they are short stories and they're written for things like periodicals where they have word limits. By condensing language and by using language a little bit figuratively at times, they're able to put a lot more story into far fewer pages. Of course, there are many short stories out there which completely and utterly expand on everything, and you might get a very, very short story told in a very long-winded kind of way. And both of them have their own sets of merits, really. They also evoke meaning and philosophy, and they usually refer to a number of philosophical statements, and particularly the really, really old ones are almost based on their own kind of philosophy, and some of them are even philosophical kinds of texts. They utilize sense and emotion, and particularly short stories focus a lot on using sensory and emotional language. And also, as I mentioned before, use language artistically and poetically. And a lot of particularly famous story writers, famous novel writers, gain prominence by writing short stories beforehand. And the reason why they gain prominence is because the way that they wrote was so unique and so, in some cases ahead of its time, in some cases just so beautiful and lyrical that they were able to get funding or to get basically commissions to write novels. And this is where a lot of particularly famous authors started. So you'll get some very good uses of language. And while these authors didn't necessarily translate their skill in short story writing to long story writing, they do show a number of different skills, which is always quite important. Ideas and themes in short stories is to basically, they are quite prominent, and they also allow you to dig a lot deeper, and this is something you actually really do need to do. You may come across multiple main ideas, in which case you pick the most prominent one. And so you pick one main idea and you stick to it and you really focus really hard on it. Now, as I said before, the thing with short stories is they condense often a lot in a small space. And in doing so, because of the fact they're also quite figurative and quite abstract at times, then when you read them and when you respond to them, what you're essentially doing is you're essentially not only digging into them, but you're also identifying which you think is the most important theme out of probably a range of choices that you'll have. You may not necessarily stick to one theme. You may have themes that even conflict with each other, and depending on your interpretation of the text, you choose one or the other. Obviously, you won't choose both, because the reason for that is because you'll have an argument that conflicts with each other. It will make absolutely no sense. We don't want that. So you choose what you think the main idea is, and you might do that by simply listing all the things which you think are themes of the text, and then basically go, I think that one's the strongest, I can write the most about this. And that's where if you're writing a thematic essay or something along those lines, that's where you would start. Or if you're writing a responsive supporting text, then obviously you would choose the idea which relates to the theme that you're studying. And certainly short stories give you quite a lot in that regard. You also use points on the author's technique as style as well. So this helps you to go into the argument a little bit deeper, in that it doesn't just represent a story for a theme. The theme is also sort of heightened by the way that the author writes. And particularly in short stories, this is far more noticeable than what it is in extended prose. Now, obviously there are some novels which really do use a quality of writing which is almost akin to a short story. But the thing is that short story shows it a lot more often, and a lot more I guess, commonly than what you would see it in an extended narrative, and obviously gives you a little bit more to talk about. Plus, it is a short story, so it makes it a bit easier. All right. Now, the value of a text and argument is quite important, and certainly it adds merit to the themes and techniques you discuss. And the thing that you need to really look at, particularly if you're going to use short stories as a supporting text, is that not only do they give a lot of themes and techniques to discuss, but also you need to look at the merit of their philosophical argument for the meaning that they're trying to raise in the story, and also just through the way that it's artistically and almost metaphorically at times put together. So if it uses figurative language, why it does that. And by doing that and by identifying the theme of the text, you're able to actually go into some depth about it and also go into some appreciation about it. Now, obviously, by appreciation, I don't mean that you go and sing the praises of this short story and say it's the best thing ever, everyone should read it. What I mean by that is by going through the language, the text, the ideas, not only will it give you a sort of depth of things to write about, but it's also very good practice, and it also gives you a range of response that will allow you to really connect with the text in a meaningful sort of way. So that's what I mean by appreciation, is by connecting with the text in a meaningful way. Now, the origin of many short stories aren't as detailed as prose, and certainly if you type in a Google search for a lot of short stories, you may not find a lot of information about where they came from, and certainly you won't be focusing so much on their context anyway. But if you want to look up some certain things in that story, some of them may be a little bit obscure and hard to find. So by looking them up, you may not necessarily get an answer for them. However, that's not to say that you can't just look at the values which are embodied in an author's work. And they can definitely aid your interpretation if you can find them. But if not, then simply by just reading it based on your own interpretation and based on the themes and ideas you can pick up, then you don't really need to focus on context too much. And certainly this isn't something that you're going to study with a text and context focus. So just by basically looking at the language and style, you will already have enough, so you don't need to focus on that too much. All right, now let's have a look at actually using short stories as a supporting text. As I mentioned before, they are brilliant supporting texts. They are, not only are they basically have a lot of ideas, but the fact is that they're short, and this is that key word there. They are short text, and this is what really makes them ideal. You can go into more detail with them. You can go into more depth, and you can be, you don't have to worry about being quite as selective with your detail, and certainly you can cover a lot more of the text with the detail that you do use. So if you're looking for a good supporting text to use, obviously to have a short story, or a classic short story in particular, as something you can refer to is quite ideal. Now remember, as I said before, that your supporting text is only to complement your other texts. So you don't need to explain a story, and this is particularly another good thing about short stories, is because of the fact that they are more focused on language at times, particularly the more sensory and emotional kinds of short stories, but even those which refer to sort of things figuratively, they will have themes and they'll have multiple collections of ideas. But because you're going to be focusing more on them than the actual story, but given that they are often quite short and even in many cases quite difficult to read, by you focusing on the themes, the ideas, the language techniques, you're not going to be spending time explaining the story anyway, and that's obviously a benefit to you when you are writing it as a supporting text. Now obviously the aim is not to explain the story, and because by complementing your main text, a short story gives you the opportunity to be able to use basically multiple methods of interpretation, and certainly it means that you can attach it to a number of areas, whether or not you're talking about representation, whether or not you're talking about things such as main ideas and themes, whatever it may be. They do support text quite well. Okay, but that's the main thing about creating arguments. So remember, the thing about short stories is that they have a number of avenues which you can use to make arguments and construct arguments from. And what you're using this for quite often is to think of it in terms of the language, the artistic merit and the value of that language. You need to look at it in terms of the themes and philosophies that are raised in the story. You need to look at it in terms of just the language and style. And by doing all those things, not only do you have a text that's a great supporting text if you use it that way, but if you're just studying it on its own merits, then you'll have an appreciation for language, appreciation for various ideas and themes, which will serve you well when you're looking at other texts, and certainly will give you a good appreciation for the way that language is used and used effectively. But otherwise, that's about it for making arguments out of short stories. Until next time, I'll see you later.